Okay, everybody. This is Independent Press Project. I'm going live with Donald Trump. It's airstrike on Syria. I'm gonna let this stream run while we get some updates here, and as we get updates, we will be sharing them with you guys. Stay tuned. Thank you.
Well, from the briefing we just had, which didn't, in many ways, those very specific questions you laid out, we put to both of our briefers and they didn't directly answer them. But what we can gather from the timeline they did sketch out, the final decision was made today, but early on, General McMaster said, President Trump said, of the three options presented to him, he only said go forward with two of them, and that inaction was not an option under consideration here. So it sounds like they had gathered multiple military options for the president to review, and this final action is the one that he chose to go with. It sounded like today, I know one of my colleagues at the White House right now, Jackie Almani, was reporting that the vice president was actually in the Situation Room during these strikes, also monitoring it. We heard from General McMaster that this was a full meeting of the National Security Council on two occasions where they looked through these options and really talked through it. But I do want to also point out, Elaine, when we talk about the president's emotional response, you know, the message was supposed to be sent here. This wasn't emotion, this was strategic. But the president repeatedly, in what he has actually said about these strikes, is that what changed his mind was those images of beautiful babies, babies and children murdered by this poison gas. And the point was raised in this briefing to the Secretary of State, well, does the president now want to revisit his decision to block those Syrians from America? Remember, those Syrian civilians, many of whom have become refugees, if the president's travel ban goes through, would not be allowed to enter the United States of America. So it was an interesting question in this context to say, now that the president has felt himself so moved by the plight of those people, those civilians in Syria, does that change his mind about whether he will give refuge to any of those individuals here in the U.S.? And they just simply said, that's not even how we're connecting the dots. We're not talking about that at this time. So we'll see if we see any further evolution or extrapolation from what happened today into President Trump's thinking on other big national security issues.
And was there anything more, Margaret? You talked about the fact that the Chinese president is there and the North Korea threat is ever looming, and it's very clear this administration wants some sort of help from the Chinese in dealing with North Korea. Do they believe that this might somehow push the Chinese to be more aggressive on the North Korean front?
Well, they wouldn't go that far in this briefing, but I know from speaking to other U.S. officials who are very involved with national security that privately they're increasingly frustrated with both Russia and with China, and calling them out by name, saying that they continue to shield the Assad regime, a war criminal, when he goes through with chemical weapons attacks, when they go to the UN Security Council and prevent any kind of action being taken against Syria, that's a problem for the United States. You can easily make that parallel to North Korea. When you look at Kim Jong-un, the very mercurial leader there, whose regime has been blamed with so many war crimes for just horrible crimes against his own people in terms of starvation and human rights abuses, that message is also being sent there, that when you shield bad actors, we will blame you as well when they take bad action. So you see a foreign policy slowly coming into focus here, but I have to say, the national security team is still trying to hammer it out. You can't walk away from today and say we know what a Trump doctrine is, but we know that they at least want to be taken seriously when they threaten the use of military force.
All right, Margaret Brennan at Mar-a-Lago with the president. Margaret, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'd like to bring in our CBS News national security correspondent David Martin at the Pentagon, as well as former Deputy Director of the CIA, Michael Burrell, who's in our Washington bureau. First, let's start with you, David. What is it that you can tell us about this attack?
Well, I heard you asking just a moment before why this particular airfield was hit, and the reason is because it is believed to be the source of that chemical weapons attack. The plane which dropped the chemical weapon on that village is believed to have taken off from this base. So it's a direct response to that chemical weapons attack. It is a cruise missile strike. A cruise missile is basically an unmanned aircraft. It does not put any air crews at risk. And although the U.S. can certainly handle Syrian air defenses, there are also Russian air defenses now deployed in Syria, and this using cruise missiles would be the option which carried the least risk for Americans. And as one of your previous guests said, the cruise missile, in this case fired from ships in the eastern Mediterranean, is a very accurate weapon. So if they performed as they should, they would have hit their targets, which consisted of hangars and fuel storage areas and basically everything of value to the operations of that base. A total of nearly 60 cruise missiles was launched, and each one of those missiles has a warhead of 1,000 pounds. It will be a while, of course, before we know the results. One possible concern that I haven't heard any Pentagon official mention yet is that if this is the location where a chemical weapons attack originated, does that mean there are other chemical weapons stored in bunkers on that base? And if so, were those bunkers hit by U.S. weapons? Now, during the early 2000s, when the U.S. was preparing for airstrikes and the invasion of Iraq, it developed weapons that were specifically intended to strike chemical weapons facilities and use extremely high heat to vaporize the gas. Don't know yet if those kinds of weapons were used in this attack.
I want to bring in Mike Morrell, who's also joining us right now. Mike, there are reasons why the Obama administration wasn't more aggressive in Syria. What are those, and why is this coming now?
There was a concern in the Obama administration that there was a slippery slope, that any attacks against the Syrian regime could lead to eventually U.S. boots on the ground. So there was a risk averseness, and I think that is what led the president to do what he decided to do at the end of the day.
And Mike, when you're talking about creating some sort of a war plan, dealing with Syria, obviously CENTCOM is involved in planning any sort of a war preparation with Syria. What goes into deciding what type of strike to launch and how effective it'll be in a situation like this?
The most important determinant is what is your objective? And it seems that the objective here was to deter the Assad regime from doing this again. As David pointed out, this was an airfield that was related specifically to the attack.
Some U.S. cities have been activated.
Officers to report in. Facility.
This is still unconfirmed.
So it really seems that this is not an attempt to get rid of Assad. This is an attempt to tell him not to do this again.
Like I said, reserve Marine units in some U.S. cities have been activated. Officers to report in. This is still unconfirmed. I will keep updating as I get more.
Any sense from the Pentagon as to why they chose to strike tonight and this particular target?
When he was a general, now of course he's the Secretary of Defense, he was always frustrated by the hand-wringing in Washington that would go on every time there was a proposal for a retaliation somewhere in the world. And I think, and I don't know this, but just from knowing him, I think he would have urged the president to act swiftly, that the retaliation has to come very soon after the offense in order to establish that you mean business. Mike would know this better than I, but compared to the deliberate pace that these kinds of operations were examined and then developed during the Obama administration, this operation moved at the speed of light.
All right, we are just getting some information from the radio pool traveling with the president there at Mar-a-Lago. The president says that he authorized the strike on Syria and that there was no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons. Again, that information coming from the radio pool that is with the president at his Mar-a-Lago resort. David, let me ask you about the timing. I know that you've talked about that, but in terms of the planning for a strike like this, how quickly would this plan have to come together? Is this something that can come together very quickly, this kind of strike, or is the planning for this something that would have had to take place weeks, even months prior?
When you spend $600 billion a year on defense, you have a lot of capabilities. I mean, the U.S. in this case chose to use cruise missiles launched from ships, but it could have just as easily have used cruise missiles launched from aircraft, or it could have used precision-guided bombs launched from aircraft. I think in the following days we are probably going to learn that there was a very exciting night in the Mediterranean, because the two ships that were involved in this attack were actually quite some distance from the eastern Mediterranean, from being within range of this airfield. And they had to steam at flank speed for much of the day in order to reach an area from which they could hit this airfield. And they wanted to do it at night, because at night you have fewer people about, and that reduces the chances of civilian casualties. And this attack was launched at about 8:45 p.m. Our time here on the East Coast, and that would have been the early morning hours in Syria, but still before the sun has come up.
David Martin and Mike Morrell joining us now. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I want to bring in Sean Sullivan, a congressional reporter for the Washington Post. Sean, by my counts today, I believe it was Republican Senators Paul Rand, John McCain, Mike Lee, Bob Corker. All of them have come out. It's not just Democrats saying that there needs to be some sort of congressional approval before there is airstrikes. What are you hearing? What are your sources saying about the authorization of this activity?
Well, you're right. I think earlier today we did see some warnings sent by members of Congress, and you're right, not just Democrats, but members of the president's own party who are saying, look, we need Congress to play a role. But that said, we've seen statements in the last hour or so from Lindsey Graham and John McCain to, hawkish Republicans who are very heavily focused on national security, actually applauding the president for taking this action. The question from here is whether this targeted strike, gets followed up by more actions, or whether this is a one-time situation for now, and how Congress will react to that. Because I think if you see, the United States get more involved in Syria, then yes, you are going to see members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, come out and say, hold on a second, Congress needs to play a role here if this is going to be, an intensifying campaign on the part of the U.S. military. So that's something the president's going to have to watch.
I can say one thing. Lindsey Graham and John McCain applauding Donald Trump for this action should not be a surprise to any of us.
Digital journalist Alan He, just a short time ago, this is reaction after word of this strike was revealed. Let's go ahead and play that tape.
First reaction is to obviously acknowledge and appreciate the skill, the bravery of our men and women in uniform and in our armed forces. The president took an appropriate step tonight, and this is not just symbolic. It is he took an attack against an airfield that was the airfield from which these chemical attacks were conducted against innocent civilians, and I think the president made the right move. And so obviously now it is an attack that had a strategic objective, degrading Assad's capability to continue to attack his own people with nerve agents like sarin.
Was 59 cruise missiles enough, though?
Well, again, we'll have to see the aftermath of it. I trust our men and women in the military who make these decisions and build out these packages. I will tell you that, once again, the targeting of a specific airfield from which these chemical attacks were conducted from was the right move, and I am confident that the president and that the administration and his military officials put in place the sheer number necessary to achieve the objective.
Now, longer term, does there have to be a AUMF?
Well, again, tonight was a move to degrade, in an emergency situation, the ability of Bashar al-Assad to conduct chemical weapons attacks against his own people. The president is not going to announce tonight that some sort of longer-term engagement. I would imagine if that moment were to arrive, that he would come to Congress at that point and seek authorization to move forward. But tonight he acted under his authority as Commander-in-Chief. to target a facility that was being used to gas and kill babies and children, and he made the right choice.
And last question, any concerns about hitting potential Russian troops in the area?
This was a targeting of a facility that was used to conduct chemical weapons attacks against innocent civilians. If Russians happen to be there, then that means they were complicit in these chemical attacks.
All right, Senator Marco Rubio there speaking to our CBS News digital journalist Alan He just a short time ago. Sean, you were listening to that. We heard the question there that Alan posed about an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force. Basically, what Rena was mentioning earlier, the question of whether or not there should be congressional approval here for military action, further military action. We should note that even as we were listening to that, we were also getting reaction from other lawmakers as well. In fact, a statement by Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham essentially praising the decision that the president made to go ahead and carry out this strike. But at one point in this statement, I want to just read this, Sean, for you and get your take on this. This is what the senators say. Building on tonight's credible first step, we must finally learn the lessons of history and ensure that tactical success leads to strategic progress. That means following through with a new comprehensive strategy in coordination with our allies and partners to end the conflict in Syria. So let me get your thoughts on what it is that we are likely to hear now. In the wake of actual military action, there was a question all day about whether, in fact, there would be such a move on the part of President Trump. Now we have that answered. What is next here for those lawmakers who supported this decision, but who also may be looking at perhaps whether there needs to be congressional involvement for further escalation if it comes to that in Syria?
Yeah, it's a really complicated question, I think. When you look at what Senator Rubio just said, when you look at the statement from Lindsey Graham and John McCain, what we're seeing is pretty strong support for the president right now from leading members of his party who have a close eye and work on national security and foreign policy issues. But I think you also heard from Rubio there, this idea that if there are more strikes, if there are, more involved military campaigns, that the president would go to Congress and ask for their approval. If he doesn't do that, then I think you might start to see a problem emerge where you have Republicans and Democrats saying, well, hold on a second, this president needs to consult us more. And this comes after, a period of time early in Trump's presidency where there has been a lot of concern on Capitol Hill that the president has not been consulting Democrats and Republicans. In fact, when he came out with his controversial travel ban earlier this year, we heard from a lot of Republicans who said, I didn't know that this was even coming. I didn't even know that this was in the works. So there's already skepticism on Capitol Hill among Republicans and Democrats about how the president is going to conduct his foreign policy and his national security policies. And this is really a really big test for him right now. And it sounds like so far tonight, at least from Graham, McCain, Rubio, that they're giving him the benefit of the doubt. The question is, how long that lasts. And you mentioned Graham and McCain statement advocating very, very specific and aggressive tactics against the Assad regime.
Thank you, Mike Robertson. For those of you who not tuned into the chat, Mike Robertson just gave us an update saying the governor of Homs province in Syria says U.S. airstrike on military installation helps terrorist forces. He also says Russian state TV reporting several killed and injured in U.S. airstrikes on Syria, per BBC. Stever. This contradicts initial U.S. assessment, Homs. So, hopefully we don't get some Russian aggression from this. Hearing Russians were on the ground at that airbase in housing developments there. Well, we will keep updating as we get more.
And they spoke to a mom, and this mother said, I'm sorry, my son died yesterday. I have nothing left to say to the world. If the world wanted to stop this, they would have done so by now. One more chemical attack in a town the world hasn't heard of won't change anything. Do you have a sense that the folks in Congress are thinking of more aggressive action, possibly a no-fly zone?
I think that's a possibility. I think one thing that I'm sensing is that a lot of them are looking at these reports. A lot of them are looking at these dispatches and these images that we're seeing of the impact of this attack, and saying, look, the United States needs to do something, the world needs to do something. We can't just sit here. I think it's striking a lot of lawmakers in a deeply personal way, and I think that's why we're sort of seeing them speak out on this. We'll see in the coming days what lawmakers are going to advocate. There's probably going to be a debate about this. There's almost certainly not going to be, total unanimity about what needs to happen. The question is, for the president, how much support he can count on from his party at a time when he's alienated himself from his party in a lot of ways. But again, if tonight is an early indication, when you hear from John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, and let's remember, these are three Republicans who have been pretty openly critical of this president's foreign policy when they've disagreed with him, and they were pretty critical of him during the campaign where they disagreed with him. So for them to be on his side tonight and essentially be applauding his actions.
Okay, everybody, unconfirmed, but U.S. military is going for a second round of airstrikes on Shayrat, Syria's airbase right now. It's still unconfirmed, but the United States military is dropping a second round of airstrikes on Shayrat, Syria at this moment.
Durbin of Illinois, Democrat, who says in this statement, my preliminary briefing by the White House indicated that this was a measured response to the Syrian nerve gas atrocity. Any further action will require close scrutiny by Congress, and any escalation beyond airstrikes or missile strikes will require engaging the American people in that decision. So already it seems we are hearing calls from Democrats like Senator Durbin to go ahead and ensure that there is consultation with Congress if in fact there is an escalation of military activity.
Absolutely. I think what you hear in that statement is essentially a warning to the president saying, look, if you're going to go beyond this, if you're going to go further, you need to talk to Congress. You need to involve us in this situation. You need to get our input. And I think we're going to hear more lawmakers in both parties probably say that, or some version of that as time goes on, especially if, there are, other actions that are taken in Syria. And the question for this administration is, what their relationship, what their working relationship is like with members of Congress. There have been some really, really, really rocky patches. We talked about the travel ban earlier. That's something that I think really, really kind of deeply upset the relationship between Trump and Congress, not just Democrats, but again, Republicans who were caught off guard by that. This will be a test of how that working relationship can function right now, how Trump's top aides at the White House can work with congressional leaders, and whether they can be on the same page when it comes to how the United States is dealing with Syria, or whether there will be really, really big disagreements coming. And that's what we're going to find out soon, I think.
All right. Sean Sullivan with the Washington Post. Sean, thanks very much for your insight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
CBSN. CBS plus N as in news.
Another developing story out of the White House.
Or N as in right now. Or newest video.
They have hope.
Or network of global reporters. Or never worrying about credibility or trust. CBSN. Online, on your connected TV, or any mobile device. Anywhere, any.
The Institute of the Study of War. Stay with us. You're watching CBSN.
Okay. I'll bring it back up momentarily, guys. Thanks for sticking with me. Well, guys and girls, sorry about that, ladies. Be back momentarily. Sorry for the interruption. We're just letting their commercials roll out on that live stream for the moment, and we'll be right back up in just a second.
Get involved in the war. And then, as recently as last week, we had signs from the Trump administration that they were not going to focus on Bashar al-Assad and that they were generally accepting his role for the foreseeable future in Syria. Now we see how things have changed, and you can really see that there's a realization dawning on the Trump administration and perhaps President Trump himself that you really cannot separate the ISIS problem from the broader Syrian civil war. ISIS as a group exists not to get involved in the war.
Tag chemical weapons. I think the purpose of this strike was a punitive retaliation for the use of chemical weapons and hopefully a deterrent for the future use of chemical weapons. One thing I would say, very remarkable how quickly this strike came together. That's one of the advantages of a Tomahawk cruise missile. It literally takes about 5 minutes to program and fire, whereas with manned missions, I'm a retired naval aviator, it can take a long time to get the aviator spun up. They got to get briefed, the aircraft got to get pre-flighted, loaded, etc. This really is sort of push button warfare. And I don't want to minimize the fact that we're talking about a lot of human beings being killed tonight, but it really is a unique capability to be able to program, target, and launch a missile on very short notice like this.
Christopher, my question tonight, though, is do you believe that this attack was a warning shot, or do you believe that this tips the balance of power in Syria with this conflict?
I don't think it tips the balance of the power based on what we've seen so far. It's an excellent question because you've got a lot of competing interests there. You've got the Syrian Arab regime, or the Syrian Assad regime, which is really on life support from both Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. Without any one of those three external agents supporting the Assad regime, it's likely or possible that the Assad regime would fall. So remains to be seen how Iran and Russia react to this. One of your previous guests said this may be a green light for Iran to start attacking Americans operating in Syria. That's certainly the game plan they followed in Iraq from the middle of 2003 on, when Iranian-sponsored attacks against U.S. soldiers in southern and central Iraq cost literally hundreds of lives. So it remains to be seen how both Russia and Iran react to this. I'm also very interested to see how the U.S. Navy managed the problem with the Russian surface-to-air missiles in and around Latakia and Tartus. I wonder if the U.S. Navy simply avoided those areas altogether or had some active suppression of enemy air defenses. That's something we just won't know yet for several days.
Mikey, I have a question for you. I'm wondering about one of the concerns about launching airstrikes against military targets in Syria has always been that many of these airstrip installations are centered around populated areas where there are civilians. Obviously, the Pentagon wants to minimize any sort of casualties among civilians. So when they are picking these targets, why do you think this particular airfield was chosen today, if you had to guess? Mikey, are you still there? Do we still have Mikey Kay with us with the Royal Air Force? Christopher, if you wouldn't mind weighing in on that question.
No, I understand the question. I believe that this was the airbase from which the chemical weapon attack was launched. I can't say that with certainty, but it appears the geography looks right, the timing looks right, the spacing looks right. In terms of avoiding civilian damage, avoiding what we euphemistically call collateral damage, and again, keep in mind we're talking about actual human beings here. There is no more accurate weapon on Earth than Tomahawk cruise missile. It has a range of 1,000 miles and has an accuracy within 1 meter. We've been using these things for almost 30 years, and over the last 10 years, we've got about a 99% reliability rate on this. That means 99% of the time, the missile comes off the rail, it goes where it's supposed to, it hits where it's supposed to within 1 meter. So I think we're relatively safe from the prospect of significant collateral damage. And I think what's happening here is twofold. Number one, punitive action, punishing the Assad regime for using this airbase to launch chemical weapons attacks, and also cratering the runway, making it impossible for the Syrian Air Force to use it for the foreseeable future. Now, U.S. military personnel, we've got the logistics capability to repair runways very quickly. I don't think the Syrians have that depth of manpower or engineering expertise after 6 years of civil war. So I expect that this air base will be out of commission for some time.
All right. We want to thank you, Christopher Harmer, for your perspective on this still developing story. Thanks very much for your insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
CBSN. CBS plus N as in news.
Another developing story out of the White House.
Or N as in right now. Or newest video.
They have hope.
Or network of global reporters. Or never worrying about credibility.
Hang with me, you guys. I'm trying to find some more coverage here. Sorry about the delay.
American ally and other allies in the war against ISIS in that neck of the woods. I mean, they are committed. They have very, very little room to maneuver. Somebody once told me that when Australians were using air power to interdict ISIS targets in that neck of the woods, that Australia didn't have any helicopters on the ground to rescue anybody who might have been shot down. So, I mean, Australia has a very limited input into what this is all about, but on the other hand, they may feel compelled to support the president, which is ironical because I know that half of the Australian government doesn't particularly like this guy. They find him slightly offensive, and now they have to support him publicly. So, you know, they're going to be walking the fine line and biting their tongues a little bit, but President Trump is the 45th president of the United States, and Australia is stuck with him as long as you're going to follow the plan.
And we will be hearing from the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull shortly out of Canberra. He is due to address the media but hasn't spoken as yet. Joe, if I can take you to President Trump's statement that he read out from Florida a couple of hours ago. Were you surprised at his tone, or do you think it is what was expected?
Well, the tone was very good. Now, look, the man doesn't write anything himself. Some people said he doesn't even read anything. He was reading the words of somebody who very carefully crafted the American response as proportional and reasonable. Trump has had two great moments reading from the prompter. One was the concession speech when he defeated Hillary. It was very, very presidential. This was a very presidential response. He said it was violent and it was tough and it's proportional. It means that it's really up to the Syrians next time if they want to see it again. I think it was very presidential. It was very reassuring. He is surrounded now by generals who understand the language, and he knows how to walk the walk and talk the talk when he has to. And this is one of the few times I have not seen the president animated by an unrestrained behavior. I mean, he played it very cool in this time, and he read the teleprompter, and I was reassured by his measured words. And words are very important when the American president speaks, because the rest of the world are looking at them carefully and figuring out what's in this for me now.
So is the biggest question that remains right now is what Russia will do next?
Well, Russia would have done something by now if they wanted to. I mean, the Russians were obviously alerted. I see on your show that the Australians had about a 2-hour warning before this happened. I'm sure the Russians were told that the United States intends to make a response. I'm sure the Russians were told, and that maybe they got their people or their advisors out of the area. And so I don't think Putin is going to do much about this. I mean, as I say, he's not tied at the hip to Assad. I mean, he will get rid of him when the time comes. And I use the analogy here. I think he is prepared to give Donald Trump a free kick on this one. Next time, he may have to work a little closer, but I can tell you this, I don't think Putin is going to risk a Russian soldier to stop President Trump from responding to the Syrians when they start to kill innocent women and children, men as well, with chemical weapons. So Putin's a little wild sometimes, but on these issues, I think he can be very sensitive. He understands the response and the pressure in the United States to do something about it. And I only wish that President Obama had drawn that red line a couple of years ago. We could have avoided some of this, but by the same token, people voted him into office to get the Americans out of the Middle East, not to deepen the imprint in the Middle East. So he was constrained.
Well, interestingly, you speak of that red line because 4 years ago, when Barack Obama mentioned that, he was almost chastised by Donald Trump. And 4 years later, it's a very different story. Donald Trump has almost embraced his own red line.
Well, I tell you what, when a man or a woman enters the Oval Office, you got to forget everything you've ever said or thought about anything. What you're looking at is a whole new picture based on the best intelligence that satellites can provide. And you come to a whole new framework. You have to use a whole new language. I mean, people who do not have access to this information before they enter the Oval Office, they don't really know what they're talking about. They're just taking a shot at the president. So, and I like to say that when someone is elected president, that the Oval Office moderates their behavior. It really dictates what they have to do to advance the interests of the United States, of its friends and allies. So if you're going to hold the president accountable for everything he's ever said, and then we wouldn't trust him as far as we can throw him. But on this occasion, he had the counsel of his top generals. He made the decision himself. He'll take that responsibility. And he has widespread support across Congress, even though there were some congressmen there, some senators and congressmen, who are probably taking a deep breath here because the president has now passed that a very important threshold, and that is he's drawn first blood in his administration. So if he's done it once, he'll do it twice.
Finally, Joe, before we let you go, Rex Tillerson says that he felt the strike itself was proportionate. Do you think it was proportionate, and do you think the world will view it that way?
Well, I think people who believe in deterring chemical weapons might think it's proportionate. But look, you know, if it hit that base in the middle of the night and the Russians had advance warning to get out, I mean...
All right, everybody, I'm going to end it now. I will go live again if any breaking news comes. Thank you for tuning in. See you next time. Peace.